Well, hello everyone. I really love being here in Germany, and one of the things I have no German to speak, unfortunately, which I always feel tremendously embarrassed about. I do have some German to sing, however, as I double as an opera singer, and I promised Louisa a few bars, so I'm going to do you a quick bar of Mozart. Und dies ist unter schenkert. There you go. Okay, I'll go for. So, in addition to this moonlighting career in opera, I've worked with a lot of CEOs. Been running this firm, Change Logic, with Charles's support and with Mike Tushman at Harvard, and I've got Vincent Ducret here. There he is, one of my colleagues and many others. When I started 16, 17 years ago, I will never forget one of my first engagements. I've been engaged by this large European technology company to help them get started on this road of creating new ventures. I go for my first meeting, my first one-on-one with the CEO, who I will call Jerry. And Jerry has a reputation. He has led a turnaround in this company, and he is somebody who is somewhat fierce. And as I sit there with a little bit of nervousness, thinking, well, this is the future of my consulting company, and I say to him, well, I'm here to work on this innovation topic. I've worked previously at McKinsey and then at IBM, where we created these multi-billion dollar entities as emerging businesses. And almost as these words came out of my mouth, he's like, oh, we don't want any of that around here. I've heard about what they do at IBM. It's all bureaucracy. I felt about that big at that moment, right? And I'm like, well, this is a great start to my consulting career right here, isn't it? And many of us face this kind of leader, right? The kind of leader who just shuts us down and makes us choose to be safe, right? Makes the obvious choice to find out ways in which we can do things which are predictable and safe. And to some degree, that is what happens in corporations, is that the older we get, the more we get focused on predictability and delivering results. And innovation is still going on, but it's innovation that is focused on today, making today better, rather than on making us fit to the future. Now, to go back to opera, that's kind of why I'm here, right? My job is to save world opera. Now, you might think that's a little bit curious. Why would that? What's the connection, right? Well, 68% of the funding in world opera comes from the good German taxpayers, right? So thank you, firstly. And I'm worried. I'm worried about the security of my favorite entertainment. What's the wrong way? There we go. This is innovation. This is BMW's car that can change its color. They can't make an electric vehicle that goes much over 300 miles on a charge. Tesla are up at 500, Lucid at 600. Goodness knows what some of these Chinese firms that I can't even remember the names are at. But this is innovation, right? This is getting today better and better, continuing to be in today and have fun with what it means in today, and never mind about the future. And we know where this story ends. It's like they're trying to prove Newton's second law of motion, right? That if a thing in motion stays in motion, right? And we know where they will go. And you end up, ultimately, on a business school chart. This is a version of a chart that Mike Tushman has used for many years at Harvard, of a bunch of firms. Most of them have the potential to create new markets, to exploit new technologies, to develop new business models. But when disruption strikes, their response to it is to create cars that can change color but still use petrol. And they fail, even though they had the ability to be different. And this inertia topic is one that weighs heavily on any organization. But it also relates to the way in which CEOs behave. They get rewarded for predictability, and they reward predictability in others. But this makes it all the more odd then that we have a bunch of examples of people who do something completely different. Right? This story is true, but so is this story. These are companies that have successfully managed to build new ventures, new strategies, new revenue streams, new capabilities from inside an existing corporation. There'll be some startups involved, there'll be some acquisitions involved, many different ways they get there. But when you look at, we've got Microsoft on the chart. Right? Microsoft did this extraordinary thing to move from desktop installed software to software in the cloud with Office 365. Amazon's there, we've talked enough about Amazon. But what about AGC? AGC is not one of the sort of digital internet software newcomers. No, this is a 100-plus-year-old company, $57 billion of revenue based in Tokyo, Japan, and they do glass for buildings, glass for motor cars. And they set up a strategy that says, we need new strategic businesses. And if you open their 2022 annual review, you'll see two important things. Firstly, it explicitly describes their ambidextrous strategy, how they're going to create new ventures in order to explore new markets. And then you turn the page, and you'll see that they already, after 8 years of starting this strategy, make 25% of their profits, not revenues, profits from these ventures. This is a proof point for what we're talking about. Second one is Best Buy. This is a retailer. Electronics in the United States, and they have figured out how to go from this really under threat from Amazon kind of business selling electronics to consumers to providing healthcare services to consumers, helping to get them out of hospital and receive care at home. It's now a $500 million business for them. Right? So there's something going on. Even as that first story is true, there's another story that we try to understand. And that's why Charles Michael and I wrote this book with the outrageous subtitle of How Corporations Beat Startups at Innovation. Right? And this is really a story about how those companies I just described go about putting the right practices, the right structures, the right behaviors in place to make those kind of extraordinary results happen. And at the center of these stories is a bunch of actual corporate explorers, some of whom are actually in the room. I can't see them through the lights, but there's actual people who provide the passion, not for the product, but for the problem. Right? They have this deep passion for how do they solve a customer problem. And so when they fail with one answer to that problem, they can keep going and find another way of solving the problem. And they're from all over the world, all different industries. And Deborah DeSanzo down at the bottom there is from the Best Buy business that I mentioned before. There's Yoki Matsuoka up at the top there, working at Panasonic, building new ventures, leveraging AI. So there is many different corporate explorers out there. And what's extraordinary about having published this book is that it touches a sort of an emotional nerve. Being a corporate explorer is not like another job. It is not like I'm managing finance, no disrespect to any finance managers who are in the room or online. It is kind of, there's a personal connection and passion. This I learned when we talked to one of our clients who'd been running a venture for a number of years, or trying to get it started inside this global electronics company. And we sort of start to gather together, where are all their explorers today, and try to understand what they're doing. And we give them the book, of course. I've got to keep sales up somehow. And he opens the book and he reads it, and he tells us afterwards, he starts crying. He didn't know that there are other people doing this. He thought he was alone, the only one struggling, and that the problems that he was facing were all about him rather than about the organization, let alone the fact that there were people who had succeeded and that there was something that they could learn. So this is a really emotional, personal journey that people go on. But you know, there's something else. It's a great story. I've loved telling it the last couple of years. But there's a nagging doubt, right? The nagging doubt kind of like, not did I leave the door open as I left the home, or maybe it's, geez, was I supposed to pick up the kids today? The different types of doubts. But it's really about, do senior leaders support this exploration? Don't they tend to stand in the way? Those sort of Jerry characters that I started with, the people who discourage experimentation, who just make you feel like it's too difficult to carry on. And so it seemed to me that we needed to have an answer to that point for this getting out of the theatre story that Bosch and Siemens have organized here today. And so Charles, myself, some colleagues, we did a bunch of research. We tapped our own networks, but we also engaged one of these expert interview introduction companies and gathered some more. And we talked to a bunch of CEOs. We talked to their direct reports, CTOs who tend to lead this, or strategy officers who tend to lead this. And what we were trying to understand is this question of theatre, and what can we do as people who work with innovators? What can you do as people who bring about innovation and change in organizations? What can you do to more reliably get their support, and so that you can be more and more successful and get them out of the theatre? Now, let's recognize that in any population, this is a normal distribution, right? They're going to be a bunch of visionaries. I got to meet the Siemens factory automation CEO yesterday. He's a visionary gentleman, right? Really gets the exploring world. And then there's the sort of the core operators like Jerry, who are really difficult to persuade. But most of the people that we're dealing with are kind of in the middle, right? They're actually the people who put us in the theater because they kind of know they need to do this, but aren't quite sure how they get there. That's our population, and maybe I'm optimistic, and maybe the distribution is a little bit more towards the operators. That still leaves us a lot of people who we need to understand their point of view and kind of get to be able to unlock a different outcome more reliably. And so we set about this question: why do we get stuck in the theater? And what are we going to do about it? What is it that we can do in order to unlock this sort of possibilities of exploratory innovation in more corporations more reliably? And necessarily, when I talk about this topic of innovation, I'm going to introduce this ideate, incubate, scale way of thinking about what innovation means. Because for me, this really is the sort of the linchpin. If you're going to be an ambidextrous organization, you're going to get there through some version of this journey. You're going to generate ideas and possibilities. You'll notice that this starts with hunting zones. It's not a big, wide funnel of ideas. It starts with, what are the problems we want to solve? Then you can generate ideas about how to solve them. But then you've got to do the hard work of incubating them, and then you've got to turn them into revenue. You've got to actually scale them and have an idea of how they're going to be a business that matters. And so I've sort of used this notion that there are really, from the research, what we learned, there's sort of 3 strikes. This is a baseball analogy. Baseball is a game they play in the United States of America. I am now American. Charles is like, you're going to use a baseball analogy? I'm clearly also British, so it could have been cricket, Charles. That would have been much, much worse. So 3 strikes. And the first strike I want to introduce to you by sharing an anecdote from this research. This was a CEO I've known for a number of years. She got made CEO about 4 years ago, like a $4 billion revenue company. She led a successful, not turnaround, but certainly remotivation. Employee morale was down, customer satisfaction was way down. They were starting to have customer cancellations. It was not a pretty situation. And one of the first things that she did was launch an ideas competition. Right? She wanted as many people in the organization to come up with different ways of what products they could create, what ways they could generate efficiency savings, what ways they could solve new customer problems, all of these kinds of things. And then she led them through a competition, and they would pitch to her at the end of it in sort of regional rounds, and then eventually be able to deliver, and she would be able to engage with them over their ideas and discuss what they were thinking. And she proudly described this to me, and I kind of already knew a little bit of what she'd done. And I said, it's interesting. And how many of these things did you fund? Did they actually happen? Well, you know, indeed, there are not very many. And I don't think that matters. Yeah? I don't think that matters. Why would that be? Why is that? Well, you see, if I had done that and I had all of these different projects happening all over the place, I'd lose control. And I'm not really sure that I could rein it back in again. There would be just so many things happening that I'm not convinced we would execute our core strategy sufficiently. And this is really the first strike. CEOs equate what we're talking about as a loss of control, of just so much mayhem in the organization that they're not sure that they'd ever put the genie back in the bottle again. Yeah? And this is something that I think we need to take seriously, right? It's partly because we look at startups and we draw analogies to startups, and startups are free, right? Startups are without constraint. There's another story going on. Really, startups just have different constraints than corporate innovators. But the point is that notion of everything being free is what leads to this myth that you're going to lose control when you set about this ideate, incubate, scale kind of approach. But if you see it from their point of view, right, you apply the same logic that we would to a customer if we were doing an innovation. What's their experience of this? Well, their experience of this is loss of control, because it turns out that not all ideas are good, right? They're going to have a whole load of square wheels rolling around the organization that they don't know what to do with. And that is a nature of the problem, because as somebody's already mentioned, most innovations fail. You know, we want the hockey stick plan to work every time, but in reality, most innovations will flatline, and we celebrate that, as we've already talked about. But if you're a CEO, that's a problem, because if you know that if you don't believe that you're going to do it in any disciplined way, then this becomes actually kind of problematic if you're also going to deliver any level of predictability in your business results, right? And, you know, our best answer is, well, you do it really small, you know, and my colleague here is fantastic at organizing these experiments and so on. But even them, all we're saying is, well, success may come. Yeah, you may get there. There may be a payoff, right? And this is inadequate for them to fully believe. So the first challenge I think we need to do is figure out, how do we give them the experience of control that they believe and that actually delivers some level of experimentation and freedom. And I think there is an answer, and I think we talk about this answer of being agile innovation. I hear it a lot in organizations, and we get invited into organizations to take a look at the way that they are innovating today. And for the most part, this is a soundtrack, right? The degree of discipline with which this kind of method is applied is highly moderate. And the discipline is all about, can you make real decisions? Can you bring a project to the point where you're able to say yes, no, or pivot with it, right? And that objectivity to be able to make the decisions based on evidence, and to do it with some rigor. This is a chart taken from one of Vincent's projects. And it's just to say, we run this in a methodological way. You know, innovation is about a series of sprints with an autonomous team doing their work, but with organized points of interaction where decision makers or business owners can learn what progress has been made, and then they can make that stop, go, pivot kind of choice, yeah, and then move things forward. This requires us to want to believe that there is a different kind of rigor, a different kind of discipline in the explore than you might have in the exploit, and that CEOs believe this, right? That this nullifies that concern about a loss of control. The next strike is related but more serious. This came over in Charles was on this call with the chief strategy officer for a large bank in the United States. And they have 100 or so branches. They serve consumers and small businesses. Reasonably successful, good asset base. And they observe, of course, as we all do, a shift in digital business and the possibility that there are digital-only banks developing that may come after their customers. And they think, well, what if we became a digital-only bank? What if we invested in a completely different way of serving our customers? And so the chief strategy officer explained to us the research that he went through to kind of better understand and evaluate the opportunity. And after 6 months or so, he comes to the board and he says, hey, board, this is my plan for where we're going to take this idea of a digital-only bank. And they love it. They absolutely love it. They think, yeah, this is fantastic. And the chairman says, the only thing you've got wrong is you're failing to act like a startup. Right? And the failing to act like a startup is you're not going to spend enough money on this and you're not going to go fast enough. Right? A year later, $500 million later, they discover all of the reasons why this was a really tough idea that, yeah, maybe they could do, but there's no way they would spend money on the marketing across the whole of the United States to have that kind of brand. Something that was knowable when they started. And he tells us that he had described the need to start small, right? That he had started with a much smaller pitch and let me test this out and so on. But he still accepted the money, right? And this impatience that senior leaders have, and I'll tell you that this came up again and again on our interviews, that senior leaders, CEOs, feel the pressure to convert a lot of what we talk about as being innovation possibilities into actual revenue, right? And one of their responses to this is impatiently push something into the market before they really know what the risks were in doing so. And we've already heard this quote today of Jeff Bezos and the notion that experimentation is really the same as innovation. And what we mean by that is that that you admit at the beginning, I don't know, right? This is where innovations or innovators start from. And so every time you walk into a CEO or senior leader's office and you're confident, let me tell you the brilliant idea I've got, you're actually chipping away at your own credibility. Because the real thing you should be saying is, I don't know, but here are the most critical assumptions that sit behind the business idea that we have. We're going to subject those to experimentation, and we're going to find out with evidence whether we're right or wrong. This is the way to give them an alternative logic to the impatience. And when they offer you lots of money, say no, right? Because you are not ready in order to move forward. And so this notion of business experimentation has been out in the literature and in books and everything for a very long time. But again, as we go into corporations and we ask them how do they do this today, more often than not, people will say, yes, we do experiments. And then we'll say, okay, can you show us the hypotheses you had about this market and which of them you disproved? It's a very long silence on the hypotheses. Yeah? There's an even longer silence, or almost a dull thud, when it comes to the number disproved. In other words, they may start with a point of view about how they're going to serve customers and what their problem is, what the value creation is. But it's very rare that experimenters will go through this discipline of actually proving themselves wrong. Right? That's one of the strengths in this Bosch validation engine, is the way that it's almost at the core of what they're doing, is making sure that we find out as early as we can where we're wrong, because that's the point. That's the point of this experimentation method. So, second strike, impatience. The third strike, I'm going to have to say that it is so important that it may actually require a modification to our spell. Is that all right, Karina and Uwe, if we figure out? I don't know exactly how to do that. But the point is that when it comes to scaling, most of us leave it off. right? That's not really our job. Which is a curious thing when you think about it, because that's where revenue comes. So if you never have a plan for how you're going to scale your innovation, how's that going to work, right? Is it really the case that you can just leave it till later? And really, it's a matter of optimism, right? That's the kind of, it'll happen. Just leave that till later. This is really a product of the core innovation thinking, right? This is a cultural artifact of being in a business that just reliably continues off that cliff, right? Because we believe that if we just plug the innovation to our existing sales engines, everything will be fine. Right? We don't have any problems when it comes to go-to-market or managing an ecosystem or managing what we call an adoption chain in the market. And that those kinds of risks really are something you can manage at the end. I don't think this is true. They need to come right up front, and you need to have a thought about how might this scale? What are the possibilities as to how I will take my innovation and bring it to customers that actually generate revenue? Let me give you an example of the kind of liabilities you can create if you don't do this. This is a fabulous insight from P&G about Tide washing powder, right? And they observe that 40%, I think this is Americans, of people rewear their clothes, right? And their problem is how do you do that so that they smell okay and they look good, right? And so this is a product of a fabulous piece of design thinking work and a job to be done, research, and all the rest of it. And they come up with this fantastic innovation, which is the swash machine, where you put a little pod into the machine and you close the door, and 30 minutes later, the clean clothes come out and they look good, right? Didn't work terribly well in the market, right? It turns out that most of us don't have room in our homes for this device. That's one thing that they could have observed in advance. Worse still is it turned out there is a market for this device. They did land at the end of the project on a really interesting opportunity. They could put it in hotels. People like me, I've been on the road for 10, 12 days now. I've got more to come. I'd love one of these machines, reduce my packing, right? And they had orders from a hotel chain for it. Why couldn't they do it? Because in developing this, they'd signed a deal with a device manufacturer, Whirlpool. Whirlpool have distributor agreements with electrical outlets and distributors, right? And there's no way they could back out of those in order to go sell it directly to a business-to-business customer. And so just in the very construction of the product, because they thought of all they need is product market fit. They don't need to worry about this point of adoption, the point of use, the way of selling. They missed one of the most fundamental risks and assumptions in the entire business model. Let me give you an alternative, right? The alternative comes from this example of Best Buy. And what Best Buy did is they really thought about how are they going to scale. And whenever you scale a new venture, what you're doing is you're saying, I've got to get hold of the following assets. I need a way of reaching customers, right? Some way of getting to market. Partners, my own sales team, I'm going to do it online. There has to be some way in which I can reach them. Secondly, I need capabilities. Maybe it's software, maybe it's a particular component of a product. And I'm going to need capacity because I've got the first two. I'm then going to have to take it to many people. I'm going to have to manufacture it. Maybe I need to support and maintain it, right? And so the question is, pretty early in your innovation journey, how are you going to get customers, capability, and capacity? And what Best Buy did is they said, well, we actually can leverage a bunch of what we already have to do this, right? We have a brand which people trust and, interestingly, trust to take into their home, because what they're trying to do, their ambition, is to care at home for 5 million people by 2025, get them out of hospitals and into the home rather than having to be in hospitals, which is expensive and also kind of dangerous, right? And so what they do is they say, well, this Geek Squad we have today, the Geek Squad is used to install home entertainment centers and so on. And well, they are trusted in homes. They know about electronics. And all we have to do, and this is honestly what they do, we'll give them empathy training, right? So they have better bedside manner for dealing with people who are sick. Right? And we'll be able to then connect this sort of last mile in a problem that the healthcare industry has been struggling with for more than a decade, right? Actually, several decades. And they're able to solve this. But they can't solve it on their own. They need other things. And some of those they acquire, like Great Call, which is a call center, so they can serve all of these people. They also buy Current Health, and Current Health connects them to hospitals and insurers, right? Another piece of the business that they don't have. And they also do some partnerships with companies like Vivint to bring them access to some of the new digital technologies. Still scaling, but already 500 million of revenue. They thought through what it would take in order to get to scale pretty early on in their journey. And all of these things were knowable. Now, it's a hypothesis, right? Just like any element of your business model, this is something that you learn about and you test and you change. But the point is to make it part of the problem that you're trying to solve as you go about innovating. And so these three strikes do have solutions. They have the solution of discipline, and for us to show that disciplined exploration is possible. We have evidence from experiments in order to try to manage some of that impatience and make it so that leaders don't invest ahead of learning and get themselves into the sort of mess that I described. And we have the ability to develop scaling paths and start early to test some of the ways in which we're actually going to deliver value to customers. And incidentally, on this Best Buy thing, we just wrote an MIT Sloan Management Review article on the Best Buy case about how they've done that. So these are some of the ways that you can think about repairing, I think, some of our own sort of flaws, if you will, as innovators. Because until leaders, when we call them up to do this research, start to tell us about these things, we've still got a lot of work to do. They need to be telling us about, well, what I want to hear is how you'll do de-risking experiments. I want to know what the agile approach you're going to take is. I want to see a scaling path, right? Rather than, I want to see a P&L, I want to see the 5-year revenue plan, right? We need to give them a substitute for this so that some of their basic concerns can be managed. Now, this isn't the whole problem. I completely admit that. And because of that, we've got this book, Corporate Explorer, but I'm very pleased to say that in addition to the Red Book, and I realize now that this should be like the Matrix, right? I should have a blue book to go with it, but actually, no, I've got a black book. Is the Corporate Explorer Field Book will be launched on August 29th. And I've begged the publisher to make sure that this time there are a few hundred copies released in Europe on launch. So please buy them all so that they show how important it was to have many thousands available, not hundreds. And one of the reasons I'm proud about this book is that we've got a galaxy of stars involved in writing 19 different chapters. So Charles's story about Microsoft and how they use the leash model to transform their culture. That's in the book. Uwe and his former colleague Mike Nichols are in there talking about this Bosch validation engine. We have Ellie, who asked a question earlier, writing about the Man and Hummel approach to corporate innovation. We have many different authors here talking about each of the things that I've discussed so far. And so it represents a community, a sort of a galaxy of stars, if you will, all coming together to write this book. And I actually think that's a part of getting out of the theater too, because part of the theater is created by people like me, right? And people who come along and say, here is the formula, if you just do it this way, if you just use this method, if you just use this canvas, if you just do it this way, everything is great. It's just not true. Right? It takes a community effort, and this book represents that, I hope, in a way that you will find useful. But still there's a little piece missing, because we all know that those conversations with leaders like Jerry are not easy. Right? And so I talk about evidence, I talk about agile, I talk about all these different methods, but it's still not easy. But let me tell you how that story ended. Because I went from my first meeting with Jerry and then did a bunch of interviews with his leaders about what it would take to innovate. right? And how they were feeling about the prospects of innovation in the corporation. And it was what you'd expect. It was a whole load of stories about how they stuck to things that were safe because otherwise they were going to be the victim of his wit and sarcasm and that kind of behavior, and they just decided to have an easier life. And I went to him, and I said, hey, Jerry, there's some important data I have to discuss. I found the problem for innovation in this corporation, and it's you. Let me explain to you how. I was a little nervous. And his face changed. And he said, well, that can't be true. I said, yes, it is. Let me tell you what I experienced when I first met you. And he's, okay, well, tell me more then. And his behavior shifted. Right? His way of thinking shifted because he started to understand some of the impact that it had. And part of our job as corporate explorers, as corporate innovators, as consultants, is to raise the tension. Right? It's not about being safe. We need to be ready to put ourselves in this constructive zone where we really put the issues on the table with leaders in a way that they can hear, but don't make it safe and easy. Actually be willing to be unsafe. And if you don't want to do that, then maybe you could go into a finance job or into some of these other places, right? If you're going to be in this exploratory innovation space, you've got to be willing to push the boundaries of safety and really take on and create tension. Make it productive, but create tension. And so with that, I thank you, and I look forward to hearing about your successes in getting leaders out of the theater. Thank you very much.